Mariner vanished in 1970. 55 years later, salvaged figurehead bears engraved date and claw broke the surface like a monster from a forgotten age, black water sluicing from its rusted joints. It hung in the bruised twilight of the North Atlantic, a god-sized metal hand dripping with the cold, crushing blackness of the abyss. On the deck of the Odyssey, a state-of-the-art salvage vessel, the crew held their breath. The groan of the winch the only sound besides the lonely cry of a gannet. Cato shielded his eyes, the floodlights bleaching the scene of all color. He could smell the deep metallic stench of the seabed, a scent of rot and time and immense pressure. It was the smell of a tomb. The claw opened slowly, depositing its prize onto the reinforced deck with a wet, heavy thud. It was the figurehead of the St. Elmo's fire, a freighter that had vanished without a trace in a storm in 1970. A mermaid, her wooden face, carved from a single piece of oak, was surprisingly intact, preserved by the anoxic darkness 12,000 feet below. Her eyes were wide, staring, her lips parted in what could have been a song or a scream. Barnacles clung to her like saltwater jewels, and a fine black silt coated her skin, filling the grooves of her flowing hair. Cato, the lead diver, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the Atlantic chill. At 28, he was the youngest on the expedition, driven by a hunger for history, for the stories the ocean held in its gut. He'd been the one to guide the ROV, the remote submersible, through the ship's ghostly debris field. He'd seen the collapsed cargo holds, the twisted metal of the deck, the eerie stillness of a world that had ended in violence and water. But the figurehead, it felt different. It felt personal. He had watched on the monitor as the claw closed around her, lifting her from the silt where she had lain for 55 years. It felt less like salvage and more like a rescue. "Get the low-pressure hoses on it," barked the foreman, a thick-necked man named Griggs, gently. "Dr. Vance will have my hide if we scratch the paint." Ilara Vance, the maritime historian attached to the project, was already moving forward, her steps unsteady on the slick deck, but her eyes sharp with an academic's fervor. She was 73, a woman whose life had been a love affair with shipwrecks. Her face, a roadmap of wrinkles, was lit with a fierce, almost predatory excitement. "Incredible," she murmured, her voice a low rasp. "The preservation it's perfect." The crew moved in, their yellow slickers stark against the gunmetal gray of the sky. The gentle hissing of the hoses began, washing away the decades. As the black silt ran in rivulets across the deck, the mermaid's true colors began to emerge, faded blues and greens on her tail, a pale, creamy white for her skin. Cato knelt, drawn by an impulse he couldn't explain. He ran a gloved finger over her cheek, the wood cold and impossibly smooth beneath the thin layer of grit. Her carved eyes seemed to follow him. There was a story here. He could feel it in his bones, a low hum of static from the past. "Look at the detail on the scales," Ilara said, pointing with a trembling hand. "Master craftsmanship. Likely. A shipyard in Lisbon, they were known for." She trailed off. One of the younger crewmen, a kid named Marco, was aiming his hose at the base of the figurehead, where it would have been bolted to the ship's prow. A thicker incrustation of marine life clung there, stubborn and dark. "Put a bit more pressure on that, son," Griggs ordered. "Let's see what we've got." The jet of water intensified. A chunk of calcified growth, the size of a dinner plate, broke away and clattered to the deck. Marco flinched back. And then, there was silence. The hissing of the hoses stopped. The gannet's cry was gone. The world seemed to hold its breath. Cato saw it first. Etched into the wood, stark and undeniable. Not the work of a master craftsman. From Lisbon, the lines were too sharp, too angry. They were a scar, a message. He scrambled closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Dr. Vance," he breathed, his voice tight. Ilara was already beside him, her old knees cracking as she knelt. Her glasses had fogged, and she ripped them from her face, her naked eyes wide with disbelief. There, carved deep into the oak of the mermaid's torso, were a date and a message. The lettering was crude, desperate. November 17, 1970 and below it. 6 words that turned the cold air to ice. I see him. Deck 4. God forgive me. A collective gasp went through the crew. Someone swore, a sharp, ugly sound that broke the spell. Griggs took a step back, his face pale. This wasn't history anymore. This wasn't salvage. Deck 4, Alara whispered, her mind racing. Clicking through the yellowed blueprints of the St. Elmo's fire she had memorized years ago. That's aft, by the lifeboats. An open-air deck exposed. Cato stared at the words, his mind reeling. I see him. It was a statement of witness, active, present tense. A snapshot of a single terrible moment, and the final plea. God forgive me. Forgive me for what, for seeing, or for not stopping it. The figurehead, the beautiful silent mermaid, was no longer a relic. She was a gravestone, a witness stand. Her parted lips were no longer singing. They were sealing a 55-year-old secret. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on Cato. A story had been screaming into the void, unheard. Until now, the power imbalance was staggering. A lone terrified soul against the vast, crushing indifference of the ocean, against the slow, silent march of time. The date, Alara said, her voice shaking as she finally gave voice to the thought that was exploding in all their minds. November 17, 1970. I know that date. She looked up at Cato, her eyes filled with a dawning horror. That's the day a man was lost overboard from the St. Elmo's fire. A mariner named Arthur Magellan. The official report said he was swept off the deck during the storm. An accident. An accident. The word hung in the air, obscene and hollow. Cato looked from Alara's stricken face to the desperate carving. The ship hadn't just lost a man, it had taken one. The storm hadn't been the killer. It had been the accomplice. He reached out, his bare fingers tracing the deep groove of the letter G in God. He could almost feel the phantom vibration of the tool that had carved it. The frantic energy of the hand that held it. A man had died. Another had watched. And for 55 years, the only evidence of the crime had been this message, whispered. To the blind fish and the eternal dark, the winch groaned again, a sound of metallic mourning. The crew stood frozen, a tableau of modern men staring at a ghost. The mystery wasn't just in the words, it was in their placement. Why here? Why on the figurehead, at the very prow of the ship, exposed to the waves? It was an act of pure desperation. A message in a bottle, aimed at a future the carver could never have imagined. A cliffhanger, left hanging in the abyssal theater for half a century. Cato stood up, backing away slowly. He felt a profound sense of trespass, of unearthing something. That should have stayed buried, but it was too late. The story was out. The mermaid had been brought into the light, and her silent scream was now deafening. They hadn't just salvaged a wreck, they had resurrected a murder. The deep had kept its secret well. Now, it was demanding a reckoning. The floodlights on the Odyssey seemed to burn brighter. An interrogation lamp turned on the past, and Cato knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the storm of 1970 was not over. It was just beginning. The silence that followed was heavy, profound. Griggs, a man who had seen everything the ocean could throw at a crew, seemed at a loss. He kept wiping his palms on his trousers, his gaze fixed on the engraved words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. Marco, the young crewman, looked like he was going to be sick. The rest of the men murmured in low tones, their professional detachment shattered. They were salvage workers, not detectives. They dealt in tonnage and rust, not in sin and last words. Alara Vance, however, was galvanized. The initial shock gave way to a white-hot intensity, the historian in her, replaced by a bloodhound catching a scent. We need to document this. High-resolution photographs. Macro shots of the tool marks. We need to measure the depth of the grooves. The weathering. She was rattling off a list, her voice regaining its authority. Cato, you saw the debris field. Was there anything else near the bow? Any tools? Anything that could have been used for this? Cato shook his head, trying to pull his mind back to the cold clinical data of the dive. No, just silt and twisted metal. The bow was partially buried. We were lucky to get her out at all. He looked back at the mermaid, at her staring, all-seeing eyes. He must have done it during the storm. In the middle of it all, it's the only way no one would have seen him. Or he was seen, Ilara countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And the person who saw him was the reason he was carving this. The implication hung in the air. A killer, a victim, and a terrified witness. A trinity of terror, playing out on a storm-tossed deck. Cato imagined the scene. Waves like liquid mountains crashing over the rails, the shriek of the wind, the groaning of the ship's hull. And in the midst of that chaos, one man clinging to the prow, frantically carving a final testament, while another man, a murderer, was perhaps only yards away. The logbook, Ilara said suddenly. The captain's log went down with the ship. We haven't found the bridge yet, but if we can, ... The company that owned the St. Elmo's fire went bust in the 80s. Griggs interjected, finally finding his voice. Their archives will be scattered to the four winds. But the official maritime report, that will be on file. Lloyd's of London, maybe, or the National Archives. He was trying to impose order, to turn this raw, emotional wound into a matter of paperwork and procedure. But it was no use. The mermaid wouldn't allow it. Her presence charged the atmosphere. Every man on that deck felt like he was being watched, judged by those century-old, all-too-human eyes. The power imbalance wasn't just between a killer and a witness. It was between the dead and the living. Arthur Magellan, a name on a missing persons report, was suddenly more real than any of them. He had a voice, and it was screaming from a piece of waterlogged oak. Cato felt a strange kinship with the unknown carver. As a diver, he understood what it was to be alone in a hostile environment, to feel the immense, crushing weight of the world above you. The carver had been just as alone, but his pressure came from a secret, a truth so heavy it had to be gouged into the very skin of the ship. It was an act of rebellion, an act of faith, faith that one day, someone would find the ship, read the message, and understand. What do we do now? Marco asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was looking at Griggs, but his eyes kept darting back to the figurehead. We follow procedure, Griggs said, though his voice lacked conviction. We report the finding to the authorities. This is out of our hands now. But it wasn't. Cato knew it. Ilara knew it. It was in their hands. The message had been delivered to them, across 55 years of silence. To hand it off now would be to break faith with the dead. The cliffhanger had lasted half a century. They couldn't just turn the page and let someone else finish the story. As the crew began to move again, their actions now tinged with a somber reverence, Cato stayed kneeling by the mermaid. He thought of Arthur Magellan, a 42-year-old man with a life, a family, a future, all of it erased in a moment of violence on Deck 4. Swept overboard, a convenient lie to tidy up a messy death. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. The sea was supposed to be a place of mystery and grandeur, not a gangster's dumping ground. Ilara came to stand beside him. She placed a frail, age-bodied hand on his shoulder. In all my years, she said softly, I've never seen anything like this. Wrecks have stories, yes? They tell us about commerce, about engineering, about the power of the ocean. But this is different. This is a confession, a prayer. This is a human soul crying out from the deep. Cato looked up at her, seeing the reflection of the floodlights in her glasses. We have to find out who he was, Ilara, not just Magellan. The man who carved this. I know, she said. Her gaze was fixed on the figurehead, her expression one of grim determination. The first victim was Arthur Magellan. But there was a second, wasn't there? The one who lived with this for God knows how long. The one who had to be forgiven. The wind picked up, whipping spray across the deck that felt as cold as the grave. The mermaid seemed to stare out towards the dark horizon, her expression unchanging. Her secret, finally told. The immediate, shocking discovery was over. But the emotional explosion it had triggered was just beginning to radiate outwards. destined to pull the living and the dead into its devastating, long overdue vortex. The salvage of the St. Elmo's. Fire was no longer about raising a ship. It was about raising a ghost. And that ghost wanted a name for its killer. The year 1970 smelled of diesel, salt, and stale cigarette smoke. The St. Elmo's fire was an old ship, her iron hull groaning with every swell of the Atlantic, her corridors echoing with the ghosts of 1,000 previous voyages. For most of the crew, she was a floating purgatory, a necessary hardship endured for the paycheck that waited at the end. For Arthur Art Magellan, she was a library of wonders. At 42, he was older than most of the deckhands, yet possessed a childlike curiosity that set him apart. He saw poetry in the rust patterns on the bulkheads, saw constellations in the oil slicks on the water. He was a man weathered by loss, the sudden cruel theft of his wife by pneumonia 3 years prior, but his heart remained stubbornly gentle. The sea wasn't his passion, it was his penance, his means of survival. The only way he knew to build a future for the one person who owned his soul, his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Every night, in the cramped, swaying confines of his cabin, he would write to her. His letters were not just reports of his journey, but tapestries of the ocean. "My dearest Lilypad," he'd write, his rough fingers carefully guiding the pen. "Today I saw a pod of dolphins. They raced the ship, as if to say, 'You are too slow, old iron horse.' They leaped from the water, sleek and grey and full of laughter. I pretended they were messengers, coming to tell me you are well and that you are remembering to water the petunias." He never mentioned the backbreaking work, the coarse men, the gnawing loneliness. His letters were a curated world of beauty, a promise that her father was on a great adventure and would be home soon. Tucked inside the envelope of every letter was a small, feathered creation, a bird he'd carved from a scrap of driftwood, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. He carried his current project, a tiny wooden swallow, in the breast pocket of his jacket. Its smooth form, a constant, tangible connection to her dot. This gentleness made him an anomaly, an island of quiet contemplation in a sea of boisterous, hard-edged masculinity, and it made him a target. The ship's first mate, Silas Croft, was a man carved from granite and resentment. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. Silas had been with the shipping line for 15 years, working his way up from the engine room with grit and fists. He saw the world as a ladder, and anyone above him was an obstacle. The captain, a weary but decent man nearing retirement, had taken a liking to Art, appreciating his steady nature and his surprising knowledge of celestial navigation. There were whispers, rumors fueled by Silas himself, that the captain was grooming Art for a promotion, perhaps even a position as a junior officer on one of the company's newer vessels. To Silas, this was more than an insult. It was a theft. He, who had paid his dues in sweat and blood, was being overlooked for a soft-handed dreamer who wrote poetry in his spare time. His hatred for Art was a cold, hard knot in his gut, a simmering rage that needed only the right excuse to boil over. Caught in the dangerous gravitational pull between these two men was Finn. At 18, he was all sharp angles and nervous energy, a boy pretending to be a man. He'd come to sea to escape a coal mining town in Wales, where the dust settled on everything, including dreams. His father, a man with a hacking cough and broken spirit, had begged Silas, a distant cousin, to find the boy a place. Silas had obliged, not out of kindness, but because he understood the currency of obligation. Finn was his creature, bound to him by a debt he could never truly repay. He was terrified of Silas, of his moods that could turn from unsettling calm to sudden violence in a heartbeat. He jumped when the first mate spoke, scrubbed the decks with a frantic energy, and tried to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. But Art noticed him. Art saw the fear behind the boy's bravado. He saw the homesickness in his eyes. One evening, during a miserable rain-lashed watch, Art found Finn huddled behind a winch, shivering. Without a word, Art handed him a steaming mug of tea from his own flask and a thick slice of bread and jam he'd saved from his dinner. Finn took it, his hands shaking. "Thank you, sir," he mumbled, not meeting Art's eyes. "It's Art," he replied, his voice kind. "And there's no need for sir out here. We're all just men trying to keep the water on the outside of the boat." He smiled, a warm, crinkling expression that reached his sea-blue eyes. "First time out?" Finn nodded, his throat tight. "It gets easier," Art said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "You find a rhythm. You learn the ship's sounds. She talks to you, you know. You just have to learn her language." From that day on, an unspoken bond formed between them. Art would point out the different types of seabirds to Finn, explaining their migratory patterns. He showed him how the stars could tell a story, a map written in light. He spoke of his daughter Lily, his voice softening with love. He showed Finn the little wooden swallow, its wings so delicately rendered that it looked as if it might flutter from his palm. "For her," Art said simply. "So she knows I'm flying home to her." Finn had never known a man like Art. He was gentle without being weak, intelligent without being arrogant. He was everything Finn's own father, and certainly Silas, was not. He began to feel a fierce, protective loyalty towards this kind, quiet man. A loyalty that would soon be tested. The storm hit without warning, a furious squall that turned the sky a bruised purple. The St. Elmo's fire pitched and rolled, her old bones groaning in protest. On deck, it was organized chaos. Men shouted against the wind, their words ripped away as soon as they were spoken. A loose coil of rope, thick as a man's arm, slithered across the deck, snagging on a cleat and whipping back with lethal force. Finn, struggling to secure a flapping tarpaulin, didn't see it coming. "Finn, look out." Art's voice cut through the roar of the storm. He lunged, shoving Finn hard. The boy stumbled, falling against a bulkhead as the rope cracked like a whip through the space where he had just been standing. A deep gouge appeared in the wooden railing, a testament to the force he had narrowly escaped. Silas Croft had seen the whole thing from the shelter of the bridge wing. He strode out onto the deck, his face a mask of fury. He ignored Art and grabbed Finn by the front of his slicker, hauling him to his feet. "You useless little whelp," he roared, his voice carrying over the wind. "Are you trying to get yourself killed? Do you know what the paperwork for that is?" He shook Finn violently, the boy's head snapping back and forth. "It wasn't his fault," Art said, stepping between them. He stood his ground, his smaller frame unyielding. The rope came loose. Silas released Finn, who crumpled to the deck, and turned his cold eyes on Art. "Stay out of this, Magellan. This is between me and my charity case. He's a boy, and he's part of this crew," Art said, his voice level and calm. A stark contrast to the violence of the storm and the man in front of him. "He deserves to be treated with respect." For a moment, the two men stood frozen, a tableau of opposing forces. The dreamer against the brute. Silas's lip curled into a sneer. He looked Art up and down, his gaze filled with contempt. "Respect," he spat. "You wouldn't know the first thing about it. You're a tourist, a passenger playing at being a sailor. Get back to your post before I write you up for insubordination." He gave Art a hard shove, sending him stumbling backward. Silas turned and stalked away, barking orders at the other men. Art helped Finn to his feet, his hand steady on the boy's trembling arm. "Are you all right?" Finn could only nod, his heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and terror. He had seen the look in Silas's eyes. It wasn't just anger, it was pure, unadulterated hatred. And it had been directed squarely at Art. In that moment, on the heaving deck of the ship, in the heart of the storm, Finn realized that Art hadn't just saved him from a rope. He had placed himself directly in the path of something far more dangerous. He had made an enemy of Silas Croft, and Finn knew, with a sickening certainty, that the first mate was not a man who forgot a slight. The debt of loyalty Finn felt towards Art deepened, but now it was laced with the cold poison of fear. He was trapped. He owed his position to Silas, but he was beginning to feel he owed his life to Art, and on the lonely, lawless expanse of the ocean. Those two debts were on a collision course. The mess hall of the St. Elmo's fire was a greasy, smoke room where the crew's true nature was laid bare. It was the ship's confessional, its courtroom, and its gambling den. One night, a few days after the storm, the air was particularly thick with tension. Silas was holding court at the center table, a game of poker in full swing. His opponent was a wiry older sailor named Jed, a man whose face was a testament to a hard life. The pot in the middle of the table was a small mountain of crumpled bills and coins, a significant chunk of a month's wages. Finn sat in a corner, nursing a cup of watery coffee, trying to remain invisible. Art was across the room, quietly reading a book, a small island of tranquility in the rocker space. Finn watched the game, his stomach twisting. He knew Silas cheated. He had seen the subtle flick of the wrist, the way he dealt from the bottom of the deck. But no one ever dared to call him on it. "Read 'em and weep, old man," Silas said, laying his cards down with a triumphant smirk. A full house. Jed stared at the cards, his face ashen. He had a strong hand, a flush, but it wasn't enough. He looked at Silas, a flicker of suspicion in his tired eyes. That's the third time tonight you've pulled a miracle hand, Silas." Silas leaned back in his chair, the picture of arrogant ease. "Some men are born lucky, Jed. Others are born to scrub decks and lose their pay. You should know which you are by now." The insult was deliberate, cruel. Jed's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I saw you," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You dealt from the bottom." The room went silent. The clatter of cutlery stopped. The hum of the engines seemed to grow louder. Every eye was on the two men. Art looked up from his book, his brow furrowed with concern. Silas's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned to ice. He slowly gathered the money, his movements deliberate and menacing. "Are you accusing me of something, Jed?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Because an accusation like that, a man could take that very personally. "I am," Jed said, pushing his chair back and standing up. He was outmatched in size and strength, but years of swallowed pride had finally reached their limit. "You're a cheat and a thief." Silas stood up, towering over the older man. For a second, Finn thought he would strike him. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound that filled the room. Then, with a sudden, vicious movement, he swept his arm across the table, sending cards, ashtrays, and Jet's half-empty mug crashing to the floor. "Get out," Silas hissed. "Get out of my sight before I forget my station." Jed stood his ground. For a moment longer, his body trembling, his face a mask of humiliation and impotent fury. Then, with his shoulders slumped in defeat, he turned and shuffled out of the mess hall. Silas watched him go, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He had not just won the game, he had crushed a man's spirit. He had reasserted his dominance. For all to see, Finn felt a wave of nausea. He looked over at Art, who was now on his feet, his book lying forgotten on the bench. Art's face was grim. He met Finn's gaze across the room, and in his eyes, the boy saw not fear, but a deep, sorrowful anger. The scene had revealed the true nature of the ship's hidden power structure. It wasn't the captain who was in charge. It was Silas. He ruled by fear, and the crew, out of self-preservation, were his willing subjects. Art and Finn were the only dissenters, and Finn knew, with a terror that made his blood run cold, that they were hopelessly outnumbered. The battle lines had been drawn. The broken pasts and emotional wounds of the three Menart's grief, Silas's resentment, Finn's fear were now braided together into a toxic cord, pulling them all towards a dark and inevitable confrontation. The conflict began to escalate, with the subtlety of a gathering storm. It started with whispers. Silas, a master of insinuation, moved among the crew like a poison, dripping doubts into their ears. "Have you noticed how Magellan is always talking to the captain? He'd murmur to a pair of deckhands, thinks he's better than us. A company man, that one. A snitch." The word snitch was the most venomous accusation on any ship, a brand of treason. Art, with his quiet demeanor and his habit of reading books instead of getting drunk in port, was already an outsider. It took very little for such poison to turn suspicion into open hostility. The crew's behavior shifted. Conversations would stop when Art entered a room. His friendly greetings were met with sullen glares or turned backs. Small acts of sabotage began. A vital wrench would go missing from his toolkit, only to reappear after hours of frantic searching. Someone spilled grease on the pages of his book, a collection of maritime poems. One morning, he found the bunk where he slept soaked with sour, stagnant bilge water. There was no single culprit to confront, just a collective, suffocating animosity, orchestrated by a smiling, watchful Silas. Art endured it with a quiet, stoic dignity that seemed to infuriate Silas even more. He simply cleaned his bunk, tried to salvage his book, and borrowed tools when his own vanished. He refused to be baited, refused to show them the hurt and isolation that were beginning to eat at him. His only solace was in his letters to Lily, and in his conversations with Finn, which now took place in hushed tones in hidden corners of the ship. "You have to be careful, Art," Finn pleaded one evening, as they stood on the fantail. The ship's wake a churning white scar in the moonlight. They're listening to him. They believe what he says. "They're scared," Finn Art replied, his gaze on the distant horizon. "A scared crew is a dangerous crew. Silas knows that. He's using their fear to forge a weapon." "You're the target," Finn said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Why?" "Because you stood up for me. Because the captain likes you." "It's all of that," Art said with a sigh. "But mostly, it's because I'm not afraid of him. And that, he cannot tolerate." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden swallow, turning it over in his calloused palm. "All this ugliness, I just want to get through it. I just want to get home to my little girl." The mention of his daughter, the raw, unguarded love in his voice, struck Finn with the force of a physical blow. The stakes were so high for this man, so pure, and the danger was so real. Finn knew things the rest of the crew didn't. He had seen Silas in late-night meetings with unsavory characters in port. He had accidentally overheard hushed conversations about special cargo and customs looking the other way. He didn't know the details, but he knew Silas was involved in something illegal. Something that went far beyond the poker games in the mess hall. The situation came to a head in the port of Tangier. A rumor swept through the ship, a surprise. Customs inspection was scheduled. Panic, cold and sharp, flickered in Silas's eyes for the first time. He became a coiled spring of paranoia. He saw threats everywhere, but his gaze lingered longest on Art. Art, the company man. Art, the captain's favorite. Art, the man who saw too much and said too little. In Silas's paranoid mind, Art became the single greatest threat to his clandestine operation and his freedom. He had to be removed. The day before they were due to sail, Silas confronted Art on the deserted cargo deck. The heat of the Moroccan sun beat down, making the air shimmer. "I know what you are," Silas said, his voice low and venomous. He dispensed with the pretense of civility. "You're a rat, Magellan. A little bird, singing to the captain." Art didn't flinch. He turned from coiling a rope and faced his tormentor. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a month ago, but his gaze was steady. "Whatever you think I am, you're wrong," he said, his voice resonating with a simple, unshakable truth. "I am not your enemy, Silas. Your enemy is the man you see in the mirror every morning." "You think you're clever," Silas sneered, stepping closer, invading Art's personal space, "with your books and your quiet judgments. But you don't know the first thing about the real world, about how things really work." "I know what a man with a clear conscience looks like," Art replied calmly. "And I know what a man burdened by secrets looks like. I feel sorry for you." The pity in Art's voice was like a lit match to gasoline. Silas's face contorted with rage. For a moment, it seemed he would explode into violence right there on the deck. But he restrained himself, a chilling reptilian control settling over his features. "Pity me," he whispered, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. "You save your pity for yourself, And for that little girl you're always writing to. It must be so hard for her, waiting for a father who might not make it home. The threat was unmistakable, a poisoned dart aimed at the very center of Art's soul. The mention of Lily shattered Art's composure, a flash of pure, cold anger, something no one on the St. Elmo's fire had ever seen from him, lit his eyes. "You leave her out of this?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Silas smiled, a predator's smile. He had found the weak point. He had found the leverage he needed. He turned and walked away, leaving Art standing alone on the sun-baked deck, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, the wooden swallow in his pocket suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. Finn had watched the exchange from behind a stack of crates, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had heard the threat. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was no longer a matter of bullying or shipboard politics. Silas had just declared war. The boy's fear was now a living thing, a cold, nauseating serpent coiling in his stomach. He had to do something. He had to warn Art, properly this time. Later that night, he found Art by the railing, staring out at the twinkling lights of the city. "Art," he began, his voice a choked whisper. "What?" he said. "About your daughter." "I heard him, Finn." "You don't understand," Finn insisted, his desperation making him bold. "He's not just making threats, he's a smuggler. He's bringing things on board. I don't know what, but it's big. The inspection has him spooked. He thinks you're going to expose him." Finn's words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "He's capable of anything. Be careful, Art, please, be careful." Art turned to him, and in the dim light, Finn could see the profound weariness in his face. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Finn, you're a good lad. A brave lad." But there was a look of resignation in Art's eyes, a fatalistic calm that scared Finn more than Silas's rage. It was as if Art had already accepted his fate, as if he knew this journey could only end one way. He was underestimating Silas. He was underestimating the depths of the man's cruelty, as the St. Elmo's fire pulled out of Tangier and headed back into the vast, lawless expanse of the Atlantic. A sense of doom settled over the ship. The sky was a sheet of leaden gray. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken violence. The conflict had escalated beyond repair. Betrayal and fear hung in the air like salt spray. The victim, the antagonist, and the witness were now locked in a fatal dance. Their steps, dictated by the rhythm of the waves, heading inexorably towards the night of November 17th. When the storm would finally break, both outside the ship and within the hearts of its crew, Finn felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. The ground crumbling beneath his feet. The screams of his own conscience lost in the roar of the coming tempest. The night of November 17th arrived, cloaked in a storm of biblical fury. It was a living entity, a monster of wind and water that hammered the St. Elmo's fire, which screamed in protest with every shudder of its iron hull. Waves, the color of ink, and just as cold, crashed over the bow, sweeping the decks with a terrifying, indiscriminate power. Below deck, men tried to sleep, bracing themselves in their bunks, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. Above, a skeleton crew, wrapped in oilskins, fought to keep the ship on course, their faces raw from the wind and stinging spray. It was the perfect cover for a crime, an act of God to mask an act of man. Silas Croft felt the storm's power as a surge of adrenaline. The paranoia that had been eating at him since Tangier had crystallized into a single cold purpose. Arthur Magellan had to disappear. The storm was a gift, an alibi delivered by the heavens. An accident. Man lost overboard. Tragic, but it happened. The paperwork would be a nuisance, but it was cleaner than a murder investigation. He found Art. On deck 4, the aft deck was exposed. Treacherous, a maelstrom of roaring wind and churning water. Art was there checking the lashings on a lifeboat, his sense of duty overriding the common sense that should have kept him inside. He was silhouetted against a flash of lightning, a lone defiant figure against the rage of the elements. "Magellan." Silas's voice was a roar, barely audible over the gale. Art turned, his body tensing as he saw the first mate approaching. There was no pretense in Silas's eyes now, no sneering condescension. There was only a flat, predatory emptiness. He was no longer the first mate. He was a predator closing in on its prey. "What do you want, Silas?" Art shouted back, holding onto a railing for support as the deck pitched violently. "I want to finish our conversation," Silas yelled, moving closer. The space between them shrank until they were only a few feet apart, the storm raging around them like a biblical apocalypse. The confrontation was brutal and swift. Silas didn't waste time with words. He lunged, his heavy frame slamming into Art with the force of a battering ram. Art, caught off guard, stumbled back, his head cracking against the steel housing of a ventilation shaft. Dazed, he slid to the deck, the cold seawater washing over him. Silas was on him in an instant, his hands closing around the front of Art's oilskin jacket, hauling him up. "You and your books," Silas snarled, his face inches from Art's, spittle flying from his lips. "You and your quiet judgments. You think you're better than me." He punctuated the question with a savage punch to Art's gut, driving the air from his lungs. Art gasped, choking on salt spray and pain. But as Silas drew back his fist for another blow, Art did something unexpected. With a surge of desperate energy, he shoved his hand into his own breast pocket, pulled out the small, smooth wooden swallow, and crammed it deep into the side pocket of Silas's heavy coat. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the face of the violence, but it was a deliberate one. A mark, a piece of himself, a piece of his love for Lily, transferred to his killer. An incorruptible seed of evidence planted in the heart of the crime. Silas, blinded by rage, barely registered the movement. He slammed his fist into Art's face, snapping his head back. Blood streamed from Art's nose, a hot, dark stain against his pale skin. He was weakening, his movements becoming sluggish. Silas, fueled by a triumphant, murderous rage, dragged him towards the railing. "The sea wants you, poet," Silas grunted, his muscles straining as he lifted Art's broken body. Art's eyes, glazed with pain, found Silas's. In that final moment, there was no fear in them, only a profound, bottomless pity. It was the last thing Silas saw before he heaved Art's limp form over the railing. There was no scream, just the roar of the wind. Art Magellan disappeared into the churning black chaos of the Atlantic. Silas clung to the railing, his knuckles white, his chest heaving. He watched the tumultuous water for a long, silent minute, searching for any sign. There was nothing, just the storm. He had done it, he had excised the threat. He straightened his coat, the fabric heavy and soaked. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the salt-laced air, and felt a surge of pure, triumphant relief. The problem was gone, but he was wrong. He had not been alone. Hidden behind a stack of lashdown crates not 20 feet away, Finn had seen everything. He was frozen, his body locked in a rictus of pure terror. He had been on his way to his watch when he'd seen Silas heading for Deck 4. A cold premonition had made him follow, hiding in the shadows. He had watched the entire, horrifying tableau unfold. He had seen the punches, the blood, the final, unforgivable act of heaving Art's body into the sea. The boy's mind was a white-hot scream of denial. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. He watched as Silas, the murderer, calmly straightened his uniform and walked away, disappearing into the ship's interior as if he were merely coming off a routine watch. Finn was left alone with the shrieking wind and the monstrous, unforgivable truth. His first impulse was to run, to hide, to pretend he had seen nothing. If Silas knew he had witnessed the murder, he would be next. The logic was simple, cold, and absolute. But then, the image of Art's face, gentle and kind, filled his mind. "You're a good lad, Finn." He thought of the little wooden birds. He thought of Lily, the little girl who would wait for a father who would never return. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him, more powerful even than his fear. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't let Silas win. He couldn't let Art's life be erased as if it were nothing. His eyes, frantic and searching, fell upon the ship's figurehead, just visible at the edge of the bow deck. The mermaid, her painted eyes seemed to stare right through him, a silent wooden goddess of the sea. An idea, born of pure desperation and terror, sparked in his mind. A message, a testimony. His hand fumbled for the tool belt he still wore. His fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of a marlinspike, its point sharpened for splicing rope. With his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he scurried, low to the deck, from his hiding place to the prow. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from the ship. He clung to the base of the figurehead, pressing his body against the cold oak, shielding himself from the full fury of the storm. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the tool. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the rain and salt spray, blinding him. But he had to do it. For art, for Lily, for himself. He placed the point of the marlinspike against the mermaid's skin and began to carve. The wood was hard, resistant. He had to put his whole body into it, his movements frantic, clumsy. Gouging the letters into the oak dot first, the date, November 17, 1970. Then, the confession that was also an accusation. I see him, deck 4. Finally, the prayer that was also a curse, a plea for an absolution he knew he would never receive. God forgive me. He carved the words, each letter a testament to his terror and his guilt. Forgive me for watching. Forgive me for not screaming. Forgive me for being too cowardly to stop it. Forgive me for letting this carving be my only act of courage. When he was done, he collapsed against the figurehead, his strength gone, the marlinspike slipping from his numb fingers and clattering to the deck. He had done it. He had turned the ship itself into a witness. He had left a scar on its face, a secret for the sea to keep. It was a desperate, insane act, a message in a bottle on the bow of a floating coffin, but it was all he could do. He was a murderer's accomplice, and a victim's only voice. 55 years later, the raw, desperate message from the past had detonated in the sterile, climate-controlled world of the 21st century. The discovery of the figurehead and its chilling inscription became an international news story. A viral sensation fueled by the romance of shipwrecks and the dark heart of a long cold murder. For the first few weeks, it was a media spectacle. But for Detective Isabella Rossi, it was a file. A very cold file. Rossi was with the state's cold case unit, a woman whose sharp, analytical mind was paired with a deep well of empathy for the forgotten victims she served. She saw past the headlines and the sensationalism to the core of the story. A man named Arthur Magellan had been murdered, and his killer had, for 55 years, gotten away with it. Her first partner in the investigation was the woman who had been there at the beginning, Ilara Vance. The historian provided context, blueprints, and a fiery passion that matched Rossi's own professional determination. Together, they pored over the scant records of the St. Elmo's fire. The shipping company was long defunct, its records lost or destroyed. The official report was maddeningly brief. Magellan, Arthur, 42. Lost at sea during severe storm, presumed deceased. No witnesses. No witnesses, Rossi repeated, her finger tapping the photograph of the figurehead. Except one. Their entire case rested on finding the carver. The crew list was their only lead. Most of the names were ghosts. Deceased, moved, no forwarding address. But one name, after weeks of painstaking digital forensics and cross-referencing of public records, yielded a hit. Finnick Finn O'Connell. Last known address: a low-rent apartment complex in a run-down coastal town in Nova Scotia. A place where old sailors went to fade away. They found Finn in an apartment that smelled of dust, old paper, and regret. The rooms were cluttered with maritime memorabilia, ships, wheels, brass compasses, faded maps. It was less a home and more a shrine to the sea that had defined and destroyed him. The man himself was a ghost. At 73, he was frail, with thinning white hair and hands that trembled with a perpetual tremor. His eyes, pale and watery, were filled with a haunted, hunted look. He had been waiting for this knock on his door his entire life. At first, he denied everything. He barely remembered the St. Elmo's fire. A long time ago, so many ships. His voice was a reedy whisper, his gaze skittering away from theirs, refusing to make contact. Rossi was patient. She didn't press, she just sat with him in the cluttered silence, letting the weight of the past fill the room. Finally, Alara, with a gentle movement, slid a large high-resolution photograph across the coffee table. It was a close-up of the figurehead, the engraved letters stark and accusing. I see him. Deck 4. God forgive me. Finn stared at the picture. His carefully constructed dam of denial, built over 55 years of sleepless nights and alcohol-soaked memories, began to crack. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkled landscape of his cheek. Then another. Soon, his frail body was racked with great gulping sobs, the sound of a grief so old and so deep it was a part of his very soul. The guilt he had carried, as a secret, a cancer on his spirit, poured out of him. I was so scared, he wept, his face in his hands. He would have killed me. I was just a boy. And then, the story came. In a torrent of broken sentences and raw emotion, he told them everything. He told them of Art's kindness, of the wooden birds, of his love for his daughter. He told them of Silas's cruelty, his paranoia, the poker game, the threat in Tangier. And he told them of that night. He described the storm, the brutal one-sided fight, the final, horrifying moment when Art was heaved over the railing into the black water. He confessed to carving the message, his only pathetic act of defiance. When the storm of his confession had passed, he was left limp and exhausted, a hollowed-out man. Rossi and Alara sat in silence, bearing witness to his 55-year pain. Silas Croft. Rossi said softly, "Is he still alive?" Finn nodded, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. "I've followed him. Over the years from a distance." He changed his name slightly. Silas C. Ford became a big shot, shipping, logistics, lives in Boston. Rich, respected. The words were laced with a lifetime of bitter irony. "We'll find him, Finn," Rossi promised. "But we need more than your testimony. After all this time, his lawyers will tear it apart." Finn looked up, a new light flickering in his haunted eyes. He had unburdened himself of the main secret, but there was one more piece. A small, seemingly insignificant detail he had locked away. "There was something else," he said, his voice barely audible. "Before that night, a day or two after Tangier, I saw him in his cabin. Silas. He was hiding something." He pried open a panel in the wall. Behind his desk, he put a small canvas-wrapped parcel inside. "I don't know what it was. I always wondered." Rossi and Alara exchanged a look. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was more than they had a moment ago. The full sprawling conspiracy was beginning to emerge. It wasn't just a murder, it was a cover-up. And Silas Croft, the respectable Silas C. Ford, may have made a mistake. He may have hidden the evidence of his crime, thinking it was safe forever. But, like the figurehead, some secrets refuse to stay buried. The stakes had just shifted. This was no longer just about justice for Arthur Magellan. It was about tearing down an empire built on a lie, and the key might just be hidden behind a loose panel in a dead man's wall. Silas C. Ford, formerly Silas Croft, was more than a man. He was an institution. At 85, he was the patriarch of a shipping dynasty, a celebrated philanthropist, a titan of Boston society. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of wealth, power, and respectability. He lived in a sprawling mansion in Beacon Hill, his walls adorned with art, his days filled with board meetings and charity galas. The brutal, resentful young man who had murdered a poet on a storm-tossed deck was buried deep, encased in 55 years of success and denial. But the ghost of Arthur Magellan was walking again, and the walls of Silas's fortress were about to come tumbling down. Detective Rossi's first move was to find the victim's daughter. Lily Magellan was now Lily Pierce, a woman of 58 with her father's kind, sea blue eyes and a quiet, reserved demeanor. She was a reference librarian in a small Vermont town, her life a peaceful, ordered world of books and gentle routine. She had spent her entire life grappling with a double-edged grief, the loss of her father, and the gnawing, unspoken belief that he had abandoned her. The official story was that he had been swept overboard, an accident. But to an 8-year-old girl, the ocean was just a vague concept. Her father had gone away and never come back. The wound had never truly healed. When Rossi and Alara Vance arrived at her small, neat home, the news they brought was a seismic shock. Lily sat in stunned silence as they laid out the story, the figurehead, the carving, Finn's confession. The idea that her father hadn't died in an accident, but had been murdered, was a horrifying, yet strangely liberating, revelation. He hadn't left her, he had been stolen from her. She wept, not just for the father she lost, but for the man she never got to know. Then, with a librarian's methodical resolve, she went to a trunk in her attic. Inside, nestled amongst old report cards and faded photographs, was a shoebox tied with a ribbon. It was filled with her father's letters. She gave them to Rossi, her hands trembling. "They're all I have of him," she whispered. The letters were a prosecutor's dream. They painted a vivid portrait of a loving, devoted father, a man whose every thought was of returning home to his daughter. They eviscerated the idea that he was unstable or suicidal, a potential defense strategy. But there was more. In the box, there was also a handful of faded, black-and-white photographs taken on the ship. One showed a smiling Art, squinting in the sun. In the background, leaning against a railing, was a young, glowering Silas Croft. His face was a mask of pure, undisguised hatred, his eyes fixed on Art with an intensity that was chilling. It was a photograph of a man signing a death warrant. The final piece of the puzzle was the most audacious. The plan was to lay a trap, and the bait was Sarah's own ego. The salvage company, in cooperation with Rossi's department, announced a major press event at the Boston Maritime Museum. The centerpiece of the event would be the unveiling of the magnificent, fully restored figurehead of the St. Elmo's Fire. Silas C. Ford, as a former first mate on the historic vessel and a giant of the modern shipping industry, was invited as the guest of honor. His office accepted within the hour. The thought of being celebrated, of burnishing his own legend by associating himself with his first command, was irresistible to a man like Silas. The night of the ceremony was a grand affair. The museum's main hall was packed with Boston's elite, a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, all mingling under the skeleton of a massive whale. The press was there in force, cameras and microphones poised, and on the main stage, Silas C. Ford sat in a plush armchair, basking in the adulation, the very picture of a self-made man. He was flanked by the museum director and an executive from the salvage company. The restored mermaid figurehead stood behind them, veiled under a large silk cloth. The speeches were long and effusive. Finally, Alara Vance was introduced. She walked to the podium, a small, frail figure in the grand hall. She spoke of the history of the ship, of the dangers of the sea. Then, her voice hardened. "Ships are more than just wood and iron," she said, her eyes finding Silas in his chair. "They are repositories of memory. They bear witness to acts of courage, and to acts of unspeakable cruelty." She nodded to a stagehand. With a dramatic flourish, the silk cloth was pulled away. The mermaid was revealed, gleaming under the spotlights, her painted eyes seeming to stare out at the crowd. A collective gasp went through the room. She was beautiful, haunting. A giant high-definition screen behind the stage flickered to life, showing a slow, dramatic zoom-in on the figurehead's torso. The letters, stark and undeniable, filled the screen. "I see him, Deck 4, God forgive me." A wave of confusion and shock rippled through the audience. They turned from the screen to the stage, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and dawning horror. Silas C. Ford's face froze. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty grey mask of disbelief. The confident, powerful facade he had maintained for 55 years crumbled in an instant. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a young, murderous sailor, caught in the act that at that moment, Detective Isabella Rossi walked calmly onto the stage. She was dressed in a simple, dark suit, her presence a stark contrast to the evening's glamour. She walked directly to Silas, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone, ringing through every corner of the hall. "You're under arrest for the murder of Arthur Magellan on November 17, 1970. Flashbulbs erupted. A frenzy of blinding light. The room exploded in a cacophony of shouts and questions. As Rossi took Silas's arm, he seemed to shrink, the years collapsing in on him, leaving a frail, terrified old man in their wake. And then came the final, cinematic blow. From the side of the stage, two figures emerged. Finn O'Connell, ancient and trembling, supported by Lily Pierce. They walked slowly, deliberately, towards the center of the stage. The crowd parted for them, as if for royalty. Finn stopped a few feet from Silas. He lifted a shaking skeletal hand and pointed. "I saw you," he said, his voice cracking but carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. "I saw you kill him." Lily stepped forward, her eyes locked on the man who had stolen her father. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence was a judgment. A life of stolen memories and unanswered questions made manifest. Simultaneously, across town, a forensics team, armed with a warrant and the information from Finn, was executing a search of Silas's opulent Beacon Hill mansion. Following Finn's 55-year-old memory, they located Silas's original study, now a library. They found the loose panel behind the antique desk. They pried it open. And there, nestled in the darkness, wrapped in a small piece of rotted canvas, was a small, perfectly carved wooden swallow. Back at the museum, Rossi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the text message, then back at the broken man before her. "Have it, Silas," she said, her voice low, for his ears only. "We have the bird." The last vestige of defiance in Silas's eyes flickered and died. It was over. The ghost of Arthur Magellan, with the help of a brave boy, a loving daughter, and a relentless detective, had finally brought his killer to justice. The explosive, public shaming was complete. The empire, built on a secret whispered to the sea, had been brought down by a message carved in a piece of wood and a tiny, forgotten bird. The ocean that had taken Arthur Magellan's body was calm. A vast expanse of sapphire blue, under a gentle sun. There was no grave to visit, no stone to mark his passing. So Lily, his daughter, had chosen this. A small boat, cutting a quiet path through the waves, headed for the coordinates where the St. Elmo's fire had met its end. With her were the two people who now shared the geography of her grief, Alara Vance, the historian who had given her father's story a voice, and Finn O'Connell, the man who had carried its terrible secret. Back on the coast, visible from the water, was the new memorial. The salvage company, as an act of public contrition and remembrance, had mounted the mermaid figurehead on a granite plinth overlooking the sea. Her wooden eyes, restored and repainted, kept a silent, eternal watch over the waves. The carving had been left untouched, a permanent part of her story. A testament to the truth that had surfaced from the depths. On the boat, the mood was somber, but not without a sense of peace. The violent catharsis of Silas Croft's arrest had given way to a quieter, more profound reckoning. Lily opened the old shoebox she had brought with her. She took out one of her father's last letters, the paper yellowed and soft with age. Her voice was steady as she read it aloud, her father's words floating over the gentle swell of the water. "My dearest Lilypad, the sea is a peaceful place today. The sun is warm, and the water is so clear you feel you could see all the way to the bottom of the world. It makes me think of home. It makes me think of your smile. I will be home soon, my love. Sooner than you think. Keep watering the petunias. All my love, your papa." When she finished, a tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She looked at Finn. The old man was weeping, his frail shoulders shaking with a silent, racking grief. He had not stopped crying, it seemed. Since the night of the arrest, 55 years of unshed tears. Lily reached out and took his trembling hand. Her touch was gentle. "He would have forgiven you, Finn," she said, her voice soft but certain. "The man who wrote these letters, the man who loved his daughter so much, he would have understood your fear. He was a good man. He would not have wanted your life to be ruined by this, too." She paused, then added the words that Finn had been waiting a lifetime to hear. "I forgive you." With her other hand, she reached into the box and took out the small wooden swallow that the police had returned to her. It was so small, so perfect, a tiny vessel for so much love and so much pain. She pressed it into Finn's palm and closed his fingers around it. "This belongs with you," she said. "You kept his memory alive. You were his witness." Finn looked down at the bird in his hand, his tears falling onto the smooth, dark wood. It was an absolution he had never believed he would receive. A small measure of peace. For a soul that had been at war for more than half a century. Lily stood up and walked to the edge of the boat. She took a single white rose from a small bouquet and held it for a moment, her eyes on the horizon. Then, she let it fall. It landed softly on the surface of the water, a stark white star on the endless blue canvas. It bobbed on the gentle waves. A final floating farewell to the father she had finally been allowed to properly mourn. The camera, as if in a movie, would pull back. The small boat with its 3 occupants, a tiny speck of shared humanity on the vast, indifferent ocean. The setting sun would cast a golden path across the water, leading to the distant shore where the mermaid figurehead stood, sentinel. Her secret, no longer a burden, but a story told. The final scene would not be of them. It would be a stark, cold cut to a prison cell. An old, shrunken man in a grey uniform sits on the edge of a narrow bed, staring at a blank concrete wall. It is Silas Croft. He has nothing left, no power, no wealth, no respect. The fortress he built to protect himself from his own memory has been razed to the ground. All he has now is the ghost of the man he killed. The memory of the pity in Art's eyes in that final moment, and the unending roar of a phantom storm. The story ends not with a shout of triumph, but with a quiet, bittersweet peace. The healing is incomplete, the scars will always remain, but the truth has been honored. And in the silence of the prison cell, in the gentle rocking of the boat on the waves, in the steadfast gaze of the mermaid on the cliff, there is a haunting, lingering echo. The echo of a love between a father and a daughter that was strong enough to outlast a murderer's rage, and deep enough that even the ocean could not hold its secret forever.